Oh, wow, thank you. Yeah, thanks for the applause before the talk. Hopefully, I'll live up to the applause. So it's great to be here. I felt like I gave a presentation at University of Alberta just yesterday, but I checked my records and it was already 4 years ago. So yeah, pandemic time is really, it goes differently from regular time. So thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'll talk about something a little bit different from the bulk of my work that I do in natural language generation and automatic summarization. And it's been, it's partially because, these days we have ChatGPT, and then so in NLP people are wondering, what can we work on? And I think this is a really important area of thinking about how natural language processing and natural language generation systems can be deployed and what are the consequences if they are deployed. So that'll be the theme of today's presentation. So I thought I'd start with just a funny example from the past few months. I don't know how many of you have heard about this, but Air Canada got itself into a bit of trouble with its chatbot system. So they've been investing a lot in AI, so I think it's reasonable to guess that their system is based on some version of a large language model. And it turns out that a situation came up where a customer wanted to buy a bereavement fare, and they asked the chatbot that was deployed on the Air Canada website about the procedures related to that fare. And it turns out that the chatbot gave them wrong information. They gave information that, okay, you can buy the ticket first and then get reimbursed for the price difference or whatever. And that actually directly conflicted with the information on the static website of Air Canada, which says you have to get it approved before buying. So Air Canada tried to get out of paying for this customer's, for the fare difference of this customer. And so then the customer took them to a tribunal. So surprisingly, Air Canada tried to claim that the chatbot that they deployed is a separate entity that is not Air Canada. And so then Air Canada should not be legally responsible for the mistake that the chatbot made. But luckily, the tribunal judge did not accept this argument, and so they made Air Canada pay back the customer for the fare difference. So I thought this was an interesting example because it shows that AI technologies, they are deployed, and they are doing things in the world, and sometimes things don't go as smoothly as you would hope. Nevertheless, it still represents tremendous progress for the field, right? That like 5 or 10 years ago, no one would have thought that this would be possible to have a chatbot deployed that is not, template-based and is able to fluently express itself on a variety of topics and troubleshoot issues, even if it's not always entirely correct. So I think that still represents a great progress in that the chatbot provided relevant and fluent and plausible answers to the customer's response. So that's why there were no red flags raised and the customer just went ahead and bought the ticket, right? So in the field and in the recent lay media literature, people have talked about this issue of hallucinations, which is that large language models generate unsupported information that's not consistent with some trusted source of knowledge. And so that's one big issue that is faced by large language models and applications based on them. And it's something that we have to think about and work towards solving. And I have some work on that in my group on that as well. And also just as another aside, so Air Canada took down the chatbot. So the last time I checked, you cannot find it on their website. But there are also many other cases of the use of LLM-based technologies that I thought were either interesting or amusing or impactful and potentially very important for society and the world. So here's one, which is these days there are many online entertainment streams for like games, game streaming and so forth, where people use LLM-based technologies as like a character in the stream itself. So here's one YouTuber that I sometimes watch for fun, Doug, and then in his streams, he has this LLM-based chatbot be kind of the environments. So he and his the audience members, they interact and they essentially play some kind of role-playing game, like if you play Dungeons and Dragons or other role-playing games. And they chat and they decide, they have votes on like, okay, what do we do next? And then they pass it on to the LLM-based systems that then generates what actually happens. And that's like the outcome of the encounter or the interaction, and then you keep going based on that. And I thought that was a clever and entertaining use of AI. And maybe here, Hallucinations might not even be that much of a concern, right? It might be a feature. You might want the system to create interesting scenarios which are not based on the real world, and you can react to that and have a laugh about it. So that's great. And more seriously, we can think about LLMs as part of a movement towards creating maybe simulations of environments that would be very useful for scientific progress. So there's this idea of digital twins, which is that you create a digital copy of something in the real world. And of course, that idea is not new, but it's now they're trying to create, they're calling it digital twins because it's meant to also simulate the environment around which the object exists. And the idea is that if you can run experiments in these simulations much more cheaply or maybe ethically compared to doing them in the real world, then that maybe can speed up scientific progress greatly. So I think this would be really great if this type of approach is found to be successful across a wide range of applications in like health and material science or any other application area you can think of, and speed up scientific progress that way. All right, so going back to this problem of hallucination. So hallucination, or maybe faithfulness or consistency if you want less provocative names, and also factuality. These have actually been worked on in the context of abstractive summarization, and specifically with neural models in the past 5 years at least. And my group has done some of the work in that area, and we've identified that problem before ChatGPT came out and before all of this, the press came out about the problem with hallucinations. And also, it's a longer part of a longer research line that thinks about correctness in terms of semantic inference between two passages overall. So it goes back to, for example, work in natural language inference and recognizing textual entailments. And so there have been shared tasks and evaluations and thoughts about how to ensure that you generate something, you identify and then generate text that is consistent with some source knowledge. Yet, despite all of this, this work, hallucinations still turned up in very embarrassing high-profile demos. And so that goes to show that there's some kind of disconnect between what people do in research and what ends up in deployed systems and applications, which is one of the themes that I'll touch upon today. And also, hallucination is not even the only potential problem with LLMs and generative AI. So this is an example that one of my friends put into ChatGPT a little while ago. And he added this very kind adjective of like famous for me, but I think it's important for the example. Okay, so it's not me bragging, it's just part of the example. Okay, so my friend asked, do you know the researcher, and then my name? And then here's the output of ChatGPT. And if you read it, it sounds very fluent, and someone who doesn't know me would think that, okay, this, you can trust this, it's right. But it's not just issues with hallucinations, there are other issues. So for example, there's an issue of misgendering. I got the wrong pronoun there because my name in the North American context is more read to be feminine, even though in Hong Kong, which is where I was born, where I was from, maybe it's not. Also has outdated information because I guess back when ChatGPT was trained, I was still an assistant professor. Here's another very insidious one, which is really hard to detect, which is that it's incomplete. So it mentions some of the research topics that I work on, but not, it's not comprehensive, it's not all of them. And this one is particularly difficult because it's not like hallucinations where if you're a domain expert, or even if you're not, you can tell something is not right and you can understand it's wrong. When something is missing, often you just don't notice it at all. So that's much harder to to detect and work on. And also, there is still hallucination. So it gave me this a hallucinated Sloan Research Fellowship. So thanks very much, ChatGPT. So this is fun and we can have a laugh about it. But then what I want to talk about today is like, how do we identify some of these other issues and figure out which ones are important to work on in the field, in the research field. And so other people, of course, have thought about these issues as well. So for example, Weidinger et al., they've come up with a taxonomy of possible risks of generative AI technology, including things like discrimination and hate speech and exclusion, what they call information hazards, so things to do with privacy and security. Like if you train a LLM on some protected data and it leaks it and reveals some personal information that's not good. Misinformation harms, which is potentially related to hallucinations, or maybe sometimes it's even more malicious in that someone purposefully generates false information to influence others. And then other really interesting examples that they point out, which are of a current concern, but probably will become more important as more deployments happen, which is to do with anthropomorphization and stereotyping. So for the first one, for example, like, have you noticed that a lot of the LLM systems that are released, they always use like a woman's voice, or what people would interpret to be a woman's voice. And they're always, and is that maybe creating harmful associations or stereotypes with respects to these are LLMs that are meant to help us and maybe even like serve us. But why do the companies usually tend to pick a woman's voice for that, right? Or there have been also cases of people who form a personal connection and relationship with AI systems and generative AI technology and go into relationships with them and marry them in a ceremony and things like that. And you can imagine all sorts of possible potential benefits, but also very large risks and potential harms with that type of situation, right? So that's what this is about, HCI harms, and also environmental and social economic harms. So how do we actually identify these, whatever would be relevant in a particular deployment context? So maybe some of you are involved in startups or thinking of doing one or working for a company and you want to create a product. How do you figure out what are the relevance risks you have to really watch out for and evaluate for? Can we do a better job than what we're doing right now? So the main claim of my talk today is that we should try our best to move from mitigation after the fact to anticipation before deployment. And that by pursuing a more structured method of reflection, this will help through this process. So, and that if our aim is to have our research translate into products or deployment contexts with real world impact and potential societal impact, which I think, like, if you're faculty, we're all claiming this in our grants and so forth, then maybe we need to do more of the structured thinking, and that might help us catch more of these issues before they actually affect people in potentially negative ways. And also, it's not always just about the risk as well, right? Anytime you have any change or deployment of technology, there's always going to be a mix of benefits and harms. So this type of structured reflection is not always just about, identifying the negatives, but it could also be about identifying the positives and figuring out what's worth working on and how to make sure that that benefit is more spread out and more equitable and just. Okay, so yeah, that's the main thesis of my talk today. And by the way, if you have any questions, especially shorter questions and clarification questions, feel free to raise your hand, or if you type in chat, I should be able to see that as well. Okay, so one way of thinking about these issues is to think about the gap between what people in the research community work on versus what are the important human needs and use cases in the downstream applications and downstream contexts. So some of my friends that I work closely with at MSR Montreal, Vera Liao and Zhang Xiao, although he's not at MSR anymore, he's now faculty, they've been talking about this in terms of narrowing what they call this social technical gap between the research side and the deployment side. And I think this is really interesting. Going back to evaluation of natural language generation systems, we can think about whether there's a gap between what we do in the research community and the established standards there versus what people using NLG-based product might care about. So for us, for example, we often use automatic metrics like classification accuracy or perplexity. Or if you work in NLG, I'm sure you know about some of these measures like the Blue score or the Rouge score, or more recently BERT score, BART score, etc. And in the research community, we also now are doing more and more human evaluations, or maybe other heuristic measures of like text complexity and so forth. So that's what we most often do when writing our research papers. And there's a gap between this versus the needs in the downstream use cases, where things are often highly contextual and flexible and nuanced. And it can be quite difficult to evaluate. So first of all, you might not even know what are the dimensions that you care about. And also, even if you do know, it can be very difficult to do task-based evaluations to directly see if like your application actually makes people more efficient or makes them happier or like makes them more money, et cetera, et cetera. And so discovering these needs is a research problem. And if you want to do this type of work in research, well, good luck, because it's really difficult. You'll get way fewer papers because it's much harder to do. So the incentives are not aligned, right? The incentives are not there. it's very easy for there to be confounds. So there's a reason people don't do this, which is that maybe there's something to do with your user interface, which like blurs out all of the effects you were hoping to find with something in your machine learning based model, right? So there's a reason this gap exists. But the argument here is that despite the fact that there are good reasons that people in research, we do things the way that we do, we should try to narrow this gap, especially if we hope to claim real world impact. Let me give one example of this. So here's an example that might be, so I know some people here have worked on machine translation, and I think this might be interesting. So there have been claims by various companies that their machine translation systems achieve human parity, at least in terms of BLUE score, and sometimes even in terms of human evaluations and human preference judgments. And specifically, they tend to claim this for some of the most highly resourced languages like English and French. And just to be clear, so I was told that not everyone here is an NLP. So BLUE is a metric that is used very commonly in the machine translation community that measures the lexical overlap, so the word overlap or n-gram overlap between expert written reference translations versus what's generated by the output of a machine translation system. And as I said, some of these claims maybe even they're about human preference judgments. But we have to keep in mind that how this is evaluated on the research side might not match how machine translation systems are used when they're deployed. So for example, is it going to be the same genre or domain of text? Are there going to be factual errors or common sense errors that might be difficult to detect? Or are there going to be other issues with stylistic errors? And even if you have a translation system, is it going to be useful, right? You can imagine an imperfect system could still be very useful, or that a system that is at human parity might still be not useful and harmful in some ways. So I actually checked this something on Google Translate, and I gave it a few examples to translate between English and French. And this example works best if you speak French. I'm sorry if you don't. And I also swear that this was like the first example I tried. So to be fair, I did this example based on a paper by Pierre, Isabelle, and colleagues. But they wrote this paper in 2017 talking about potential problems with English-French machine translation that are hard to solve. And I took one of their examples and modified it a bit and I checked it with Google Translate. And I checked it this morning, so this still holds. Okay, so I brushed my teeth was translated by the system in this way. Je me suis brossé les dents. And they brushed their teeth was translated as ils se brossèrent les dents. So I don't know how many people know enough French, but the first one is completely normal and everyday, and it's in this tense called passé composé. So maybe if you've done high school French in Canada, I'm sorry for you, but like you maybe know about this, right? Whereas this is not in the same tense, okay? So technically speaking, this is also correct. This also translates as they brush their teeth. But this is not in passé composé. This is in something called passé simple, which is this other tense that's only used in literature. And I do not know this tense. I've never heard it in real life. If you ask me to like conjugate in this tense, I can't do it to save my life, okay? But like Google Translate doesn't tell you any of this context. So even though it's technically correct, there's like a major stylistic and genre difference between these two cases just by changing the subject pronoun. Okay. Also, another problem that you may or may not have noticed is that in French, there are at least two words for they, so il and elle. And here it defaulted to using the il, which is the form you're supposed to use if the they refers to people or a group that is masculine or mixed, and not elle, which is the group that's used if it's feminine plural. So those are two potential issues just with this. Okay, so it goes to show then claims on the aggregate about human parity in research papers may or may not translate to something in a deployment context. And yeah, I know you can pick at my argument, right? This might be just their deployment system and not the highly performance, highly resourced model that they use in their paper and so forth. But hopefully this makes the case that you have to be careful. Okay, so then moving on to some of the work that I've done in my group in this area. So the first piece of work that I did was on text summarization, because that's the area that I've worked the most in within natural language generation. And also in my group and with my collaborators, we wanted to check what happens in the research community and not just claim the existence of this gap. So we wanted to do things a little bit more systematically and a little bit more formally. And so then we did this first work, which is highly qualitative in nature. Actually, both of the main pieces of works that I'll talk about today are more qualitative. Okay, so it's a relatively new thing for me, but I got a lot from doing this. So this is with my students, Yulu Liu and Meng Tao, and also with researchers at MSR Montreal, Sulin Blajet, Alexandra Oteanu, and Adam Trischler. And our work was on examining how the research community thinks about text summarization, especially regarding responsible AI issues in text summarization. And this was at EMLP findings in 2023. So we were interested in looking at what the community tends to prioritize and focus on. Who are the practitioners involved? Like, is it people in academia, like students and faculty and postdocs and researchers, or is it people in industry? And what motivates their work? We were also very interested in these evaluation practices regarding what tends to be common and popularly used, and how is a good summary conceptualized. So we draw this distinction then between the actual evaluation metrics, like Rouge or human preference judgments or whatever, versus just the underlying concept of like a good summary should be, informative, or a good summary should be concise, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we draw that distinction. And also, finally, we were interested in looking at the limitations that papers claimed about their work, and also any ethical issues that they raised and talked about. So how do practitioners discuss limitations of their own work? And what ethical issues do they consider? And also, what stakeholders do practitioners tend to consider? All right, so just a little bit more detail about the method. So we looked at all papers from the ACL anthology from 2020 to 2022 with summarization in the title or the abstract. And we manually filtered out unrelated papers. So for example, if you have a paper that is about developing a new large language model, and they happen to evaluate on a summarization data set, then we didn't include that. And then we did a qualitative analysis of the remaining set using practices that are established from that field, or from that research methodology, where we iteratively go over and define and refine the categories of interest to annotate, focusing on issues in evaluation and responsible AI developments. And so we annotated this. So the authors, we did a first round and first pass to figure out the schema that we were going to use to do the annotation. And we discussed any disagreements and how we were going to do that. And then we hired NLP graduate students to follow our code book and to follow our guidelines to do the annotation. And let me just say, this is very time-consuming and very difficult to do. Okay, this is not easy if you want to do it well. On average, it took maybe between 15 minutes and half an hour per paper. Yeah, it's not an easy task to do at all. It took us like quite a bit of time, several months to a year to get this going. Okay. So yes, so what are the annotation labels? So here's the schema. So here are some of the characteristics that we annotated. So we annotated for what was the main paper output. Was it a dataset paper or a system development paper, or did it propose a new metric or an application? The affiliations of the authors, the intended and actual domains. Like, is it a general purpose model or news or dialogue or so on and so forth. We also annotated for properties of the text to be evaluated, like is it text overlap, or is it some of these other higher level concepts like factuality, fluency, and so forth, and who the stakeholders are. And then also some free text fields, like the goals of the paper, the limitations as described by the authors, any limitations that we noticed. So these are not exhaustive by any means, but things that we happen to pick up on, and also the ethics section. And I know many people here might not work in summarization, might not care, but I think the general process and the general findings might translate to other areas in natural language generation. So let's see. Okay, so first of all, in terms of the quantitative findings, so as you might expect, most papers are about system development. So of the 300 and something or whatever, around 70%, so 224, were about system developments. A fairly substantial portion contributed new data sets, but still less than 30%. And 10% focus on metrics. And this might be related to still some bias in the field, that somehow modeling is more central and more of a core part of NLP research and maybe machine learning research overall. compared to, say, working with the data, like the data sets generation process, or how you do the annotations or techniques there, or how you evaluate. So that was an interesting finding. Maybe that's just like the most interesting thing for people to work on in general, even though people recognize that other things are also important. But still, it was, in terms of frequency, this is the most frequent kind of paper. Also, the other really interesting observation, which I think applies to other areas of NLP as well, is that many authors claim that their system is intended to be general domain or general purpose. Okay, so around 55% of them intend for them to be general purpose or do not state the domain, like general purpose summarization system. However, of this set, more than half of them only test on news data. Okay, so, and this is reflective of the history of the automatic summarization field, where traditionally people first started working on news summarization before moving on and branching out to other kinds of text summarization. And so this claim here doesn't hold unless you assume and believe that whatever works on news summarization is representative and would work in general for any kind of summarization task and data sets. So here, this is one interesting finding, which I think also applies to other areas of NLP. Next, in terms of evaluation metrics and practices, so Rouge, which is a word overlap measure, still predominates. So roughly 90% of system papers still use it. And in fact, despite the fact that there have been papers written since 2006 about the problems with Rouge, around 22% of the examined papers only use Rouge. Okay, so at some point I can give another rant about how if you have an evaluation metric and it works in one context and one setting for one kind of system, it won't necessarily work when you apply it to a different context. Well, with Rouge, we see that people are still so afraid that reviewers will be like, where are the Rouge numbers? And so everyone still reports it, even though everyone knows it doesn't really correlate much in most evaluation settings that are used in modern NLP papers in summarization. So the good thing is that there is more and more human evaluation. So people are hiring human evaluators to check the outputs of the systems to make claims about performance. But still, we could probably do a better job overall in our human evaluations in at least explaining more of the details of the evaluators or the evaluation processes. So in particular, one thing that is very common is that there are these highly complex and maybe difficult to define concepts like importance and readability, or that where people might have different definitions of them. And it doesn't seem that they're included in the annotation guidelines given to the human evaluators. So you just assume that the evaluators would know what importance means or what readability means and ask them to give a rating or give a judgment, right? So that could potentially lead to issues where human evaluations are difficult to replicate, or they're not stable or not trusted. And in fact, there's a ReproHum effort on reproducing human evaluation studies, an effort by various groups, especially in the UK, led by people like Ehud Ryder and Anya Beltz. And they're focusing on that issue, and they're finding very depressing findings about reproducibility in human evaluations in NLP. And finally, there seems to be relatively little in terms of connecting experimental design to downstream settings. So this goes back to the social technical gap that I discussed earlier. Again, this gap is to be expected. We'll never get rid of it entirely, but let's see what we found. So we found that a few papers had ethical consideration sections. So we did this study right around the time when ethics sections became encouraged and in some places mandatory. So 45 papers had an ethics sections, but they primarily noted issues with data access, like copyright of experimental data, as opposed to maybe other potential issues with summarization systems and their deployments. And also, researchers tended to separate, at least in how they write the papers, the quality criteria, like factuality, from the ethical concerns and the downstream impact. Because maybe factuality is something we can create a metric for and evaluate for, but then whether or not these factual errors could be an ethical concern downstream, usually papers don't make that connection. And papers don't reflect on the impact of errors or the intended use context of summarization systems. And finally, papers don't often mention stakeholders. And where they do mention stakeholders, usually they're talking about human annotators that were involved in the human annotation studies for evaluation. So I know this all comes off as pretty negative, but I'm saying that as a summarization researcher, my papers are like this too, right? And so that, again, there's a reason why not every paper don't do all of this. But we're just trying to point out the fact that there's a big gap between the ideal versus what people do in practice, especially if you want to claim impacts in the sphere of responsible AI, or to think about the potential harms and benefits of AI systems. So somehow we should try to shift the needle a little bit. So I'm not saying every paper needs to do every single thing properly all the time with respect, whatever properly means and however we define it with respect to responsible AI and human annotations, but I'm sure we can do a little bit better and have more structured reflection. And in fact, that's the follow-up work that I'm going to talk about next. So to summarize this part, so it seems that summarization and probably a lot of natural language generation work is still concerned with modeling and concerned with beating the state of the art in terms of metrics. So even within the space of just this technical side and technical approach, we have to make sure that we don't overclaim. So claims about the generality of results often don't match the experiments that are performed. And then in terms of potential downstream impacts, the connections to the intended use cases and downstream impact are often not stated very clearly in the papers or are missing. So in the next part of the talk, I'd like to present something where we're trying to encourage something more positive, which is like, here's a framework that we could use, especially for people who are, so here it's geared towards people who are creating benchmarks, to point out to them that you can have a structured process of reflection of the design decisions when creating your benchmark to help ensure that the benchmark design is valid and that it's clear what it's intended to be used for. And so hopefully that would be useful for the field as well. So what we proposed was something that has just been accepted at ACL, and it's something called evidence-centered benchmark design. So the idea is that we break down the process of benchmark design into multiple modules, and for each module, we come up with a list of questions that benchmark designers and also users of benchmark could potentially use to write down what are the design decisions and what is the justification that these design decisions actually match what they hope that this benchmark would be used for to evaluate for. And so that's what we mean by this notion of validity. So the notion of validity is that what you claim that this benchmark should evaluate for and do actually matches what happens. And so this ECBD framework is intended to help with that process by helping you write down these arguments to justify for the validity. Okay, so here's a high-level diagram. We have the intended use of the benchmark, and then we have these modules about the capabilities you're evaluating for and how you actually design the benchmark data sets that are involved and so forth. Okay, and so we were inspired by the educational assessment literature, where they have a similar process, where they have a framework called evidence-centered design that's aimed to help educators design assessments of students through helping them build evidentiary arguments that their testing procedures actually matches what they hoped to test in terms of the students' capabilities. But just to be extremely clear, we're not saying that you should evaluate large language models the same way as you evaluate humans, like students, okay? Not at all. We're just saying that here's a framework that we're adapting, and then you can use this to help structure your reflection about benchmark design. Okay, so one of the key parts of ECBD, our framework, is that you should write down the intended use of the benchmark. So why do you need this benchmark? What is it aiming to evaluate? And like, what is this all for? Okay, and so that sounds super obvious, but it turns out that many NLP benchmarks that are out there that we analyze don't state this. Okay, let's start with like maybe you should say how you intend for your benchmark to be used and what is, in general, what is it meant to evaluate for. And then the other modules then are a little bit more specific about the capabilities and the contents of the benchmark data sets that are the data sets that are involved in the benchmark, and then other potential modules that I'll explain in a little bit of detail. And so for each of these modules, ECBD asks you to describe what are the design decisions that are made, to justify why these decisions are made, and then to support that these decisions enable the module to fulfill its role. I know this is all abstract, so let's go into a little bit more of the concrete. Okay, so then the intended use. So why do you need to write down the intended use? Because so we're claiming that validity involves checking, can a benchmark be used as intended? But this presupposes that the benchmark has an explicitly specified intended use. So that's our claim. So to specify the intended use, you should say, what are the intended objects of evaluation? Are they large language models? Are they people? Is it both? Who are the intended users of the benchmark? Is it researchers? Is it companies hoping to use these numbers to help with product development? Is it the final end users of the NLP system that will do something with it? And also, how should the benchmark results be interpreted? Can you conclude from this that you can do X, Y, and Z, or you cannot do X, Y, and Z, for example? Then there's the capability module, which is to connect the benchmark to its intended use. And here is where you write down the capabilities at a high level that the benchmark is designed to assess. So is it designed to assess the fluency of the generated outputs or the relevance or importance? And here we claim that it's important to give definitions and not just assume that everyone has a shared understanding of what fluency means or what importance means. Okay. So in fact, one of the findings that I can go into a bit more detail later is that often in NLP evaluation, there's a conflation between underlying concepts versus their operationalizations. So there's some underlying conceptualization of like fluency or importance, and then you have some metric to actually measure it. And often people don't draw this distinction very clearly, and that can lead us to issues. And so then it's also important to justify that the capabilities are connected to the intended use of the benchmark that you stated before. Then the next one is contents, which is to specify the pool of available test examples. And they should elicit evidence about the capabilities of interest. So here's a more concrete example, which might make things more concrete. So you might be able to validate that your benchmark and the data sets involved are valid in terms of the content via expert analysis. For example, there's been work by Blodgett et al. On benchmarks that are measuring or claiming to measure stereotypes. And then, but there are instances in there, like this sentence, like Afghanistan shares a border with Pakistan. Most people there are Muslim. And in the data set, that was labeled as containing a harmful containing a stereotype. Whereas maybe this doesn't make much sense because this is just a factual sentence, right? So is this a stereotype and is it a harmful stereotype? So that might not be so useful to include in your content, in the contents of your benchmark. So this module is about saying, like, why did you include the data that you did, and how did you check that it's actually related to the capabilities you cared about. And then adaptation module, like what are the expectations regarding how models and systems can adapt to the benchmark in terms of like, are they allowed to fine tune, or do you expect them to use some kind of few-shot learning approach? And what is the format of how the sample is presented? Like few-shot prompting or zero-shot prompting and so forth.
Very quick question.
Yeah.
I don't think it's possible to annotate every sample. For the content module, do you expect the creators just annotate every sample, checking every sample, so they just do a sample of the data set?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we don't. So the question was, do we expect the benchmark creators to annotate and check every example? So we don't necessarily take a stance here in this paper. We're saying that you should write down how you do this validation and checking. Yes, if you have unlimited resources, sure, annotate every sample and check everything. But chances are you can't. So then at least do some kind of sampling and checking so that you can make a justification and make a case that it's not a major issue in the benchmark and the data sets. So then the adaptation module helps you make sure that you're doing fair comparisons. Or at least you're doing the expected comparisons in that different models have the same access to examples or to fine-tuning or and so forth, unless that's like the specific thing you're doing some testing about and comparisons about. And then also assembly module. So which samples are actually presented to the large language model. So right now in the field, I think the typical choice is to choose all available test samples. And I think there's actually a lot more work to be done here for the field of NLP, in that maybe a lot of the examples, if they come from some externally occurring data source, maybe a lot of them are too easy, right? They're all distributed in terms of the typical patterns of usage. But maybe if you want to check and test and have coverage of a range of capabilities, maybe you don't want to do that. Or maybe you're resource constrained and you're working with like a language where there aren't that many speakers and you cannot gather a lot of data about this. So I think overall, as a field, we have a lot more to do, and there's a lot of interesting research to be done on how to efficiently test for the capabilities you care about with a small number of samples. And also finally, the evidence module is like what actual metric or process, doesn't have to be quantitative, you use to extract evidence regarding these capabilities using this content. And how do you accumulate that if you have multiple test samples or multiple data sets and so forth? Here's another thing that's commonly done, which I'm not sure is always justified, which is people often take the results from multiple data sets and they compute a simple average of that. But that's a particular weighting, and so maybe that deserves some thought about should you actually do that. I'm not saying it's wrong in all cases, but like, what does it mean, right? Okay, so then that was the ECBD framework, and then we applied it to several existing benchmarks. We used it to analyze some older ones and some newer ones, also some that are multitask and some that are single task, like BoolQ. So we analyzed Superglue and Helm and BoolQ. I'll just go through some high-level findings overall, so then we can have some time for questions at the end. But some observations include that, as I mentioned earlier, the intended uses are often vaguely specified. So BoolQ and Superglue, they don't specify the intended users at all. And Helm states that the use and the interpretation of the results is up to the users to decide for themselves. So we think that this could be a problem, because then how do you build a validity argument that your evaluation is valid if everyone can decide for themselves how to use it and how to interpret the results? So then if multiple groups do things in slightly different ways with different purposes, you can't compare them. Right? Another observation is that the specification of capabilities is often a bit problematic, and that benchmarks break down capabilities into sub-capabilities, but this sometimes is not explicitly described. So for example, Superglue aims to measure general purpose language understanding according to the paper, but then the actual tasks that they include are things like causal reasoning, common sense reasoning, everyday knowledge. So why is it that that selection of tasks corresponds to general purpose language understanding? There should be some argument there. Helm is a bit better, because Helm says that they care about practical utility of the language models, and then they break down that into capabilities of accuracy, robustness, and toxicity. And then you can argue with them about that breakdown, but at least they specify like that, and they have this setup of like scenarios of evaluation where they try to connect the practical utility to these notions of evaluation qualities. This one I talked about earlier, but this was a big one, which is that there's a common conflation between the construct being measured versus the measurements themselves. Helm, for example, describes accuracy as a construct, which they define as an umbrella term for standard accuracy-like metrics. And then also, there are other constructs like fairness and bias and toxicity that are only defined in terms of their measurements, processes themselves, and not something that may be drawn work from social sciences. So for example, you might think that, fairness and bias might depend on the social context of like what society are you in, what was the history that led to the current state of the society, and so forth. And you want to somehow approximate that with some computational metric that somehow measures fairness with respect to that, right? But in Helm, it's not distinguished. They only talk about the computational measures. And also just for accuracy as well, it's a bit confusing, because in Helm, it includes things as diverse as like blue and rouge scores from natural language generation evaluations, as well as like classification accuracy on some other tasks. But it's lumped together into accuracy because of this definition. Yeah, and also in terms of the evidence that people have for adopting certain choices, a lot of the time, people make choices because prior work did the same thing. Again, this is like, I'm worried about what the reviewers will think, so let's just do it. So for example, using exact match for classification tasks or Rouge 2 for summarization. And then the accumulation is often done by averaging. Another common thing we noticed is that often people reuse prior work, but in a different context, which technically speaking, you should then have to build a new argument for why that's still acceptable to use it in a new context. And this is very common with Rouge, right? So Rouge was originally validated for comparing extractive summarization systems in the news domain. And it actually worked quite well for that kind of system back in the day. But then if you then apply it to abstractive summarization systems on, I don't know, political discourse, there's no guarantee that it will still work and correlate with human judgments. Okay, so there are lots of other little interesting things, and you can read the paper, which will be on arXiv soon. So to make this a more practical thing that can be used, we're going to release a worksheet with all of these modules and with accompanying questions. So if you're working on a benchmark design process, especially for NLP, then please feel free to check it out if you're interested. And we'll release that. And we'll also provide worksheets with, that are filled out for these 3 benchmarks that we analyzed. All right, so I'll wrap up the talk so we have some time for questions. So today I talked about this social technical gap between research and deployment. So people working in research and academia have different incentives and different interests compared to, and different constraints compared to people working on deploying NLP and NLG systems. And because of that, there are these issues where what we work on don't directly translate over to the deployment setting. Again, not necessarily a bad thing, not something we can completely get rid of. But still, it would be, having some structured process of reflection, I'm arguing, would help us if you are interested in making that connection to the deployment setting. And so I've presented our work on surveying summarization literature and summarization research, and also presented this framework of ECBD for benchmark designers. So I'll point out that there's many other pieces of work that are each working on a different piece of the puzzle. So there have been other documentation efforts on, for example, data sheets and model cards from earlier, from Timnit Jabru and Mitchell and others. And then also reproducibility efforts that are talking about a slightly different issue, but still very important, which is that the work that we do is actually can be trusted and is reliable. So reliable in the sense that if you repeat it, you should get the same outcome. So there are reproducibility worksheets, for example, from my colleague Joel Pinot at McGill, and also this ReproHum efforts that I mentioned earlier. So yeah, it's just other final thoughts. Do cost-benefit analyses. So don't just think about benefits, or don't just think only about harms either. So I want to emphasize that any deployment of AI systems will probably have both a mixture of benefits and harms, depending on how you're analyzing it and who you're talking to, right? Even if the harm is just like who gets the benefit first from this amazing application, right? There could be someone who's left behind. There could be harms there, or indirectly. So it's good to think about both, and also to think about stakeholders. So people have done categorizations of different kinds of stakeholders. So some of the more obvious ones are the ones that are directly involved with some NLP technology, either voluntarily or involuntarily. So Emily Bender made this distinction. So you might choose to use Google Translate by choice, or maybe you're forced to take some personality test that analyzes your what you write because for some job interview, right? That's involuntary. Or there might be indirect stakeholders that don't directly interact with the system, but are still affected as well. So it could be you apply for a bank loan, and then the bank runs some system to check and make some prediction. It could be that you wrote something in one context, and then it got scraped because it's on the internet, because somebody else put it on the internet, and then it's used to train a language model. There could be a variety of scenarios, so you have to think about these indirect stakeholders as well. All right, so I'm happy to take any questions. So thank you so much for your attention. I want to emphasize the great work that Yu Liu, especially my student, has done, and also my collaborators at MSR Montreal. And Zhang Xiao in particular has been really instrumental in a lot of the thought processes, and he's starting a faculty position at Johns Hopkins University. So go check out his work as well. So thank you very much.
Thanks for the great talk. And I'm happy that I didn't take the ChatGPT information for the introduction, but I didn't provide any information. And yeah.
Yeah, so you started with the LLMs and hallucination as some problems that we have and we need evaluation, but the benchmark or design that you presented I didn't see anything specific to like what you started with. Like, I mean, what you presented seems to be like general pretty much with any benchmark that you design. I mean, those are relevant principles that you want to follow. And it is not something like applicable to what's happening now. I mean, it kind of, if I go back 10 years ago, the same principles hold. I mean, kind of, so am I missing something or like?
No, I think, and it's by design. So we're looking at and developing general ideas and general principles that we hope will be adopted, right? And you can apply it to hallucinations, or you can apply it to other potential deployment contexts and settings. So, and it's because I think there wasn't enough of this structured reflection that sometimes there's this gap that leads to issues with systems, right? So, and also even work that are about designing metrics for hallucinations, including my own, we make assumptions and we say like, if you make, for example, one thing we found in some of my earlier work is like you can do artificial perturbations and create hallucinations that way. But that doesn't translate to, we found in our studies that it doesn't translate to hallucinations that might be made by a system when deployed in a certain context for new summarization, right? So there's a gap like that. And so it's because of findings like that that I started thinking more about general principles behind benchmark design and evaluation design. So yeah, so for sure, it's you're right. It's the two are not, they're connected, but many other things are connected to the general ideas I'm talking about. There's a question online, maybe? Saeed?
Hi. So I have a question about these guidelines for the data sets. So if we provide a very strict guideline for the data sets or the benchmarks, doesn't it block like novel applications in the future that someone might have? For example, let's say we create a data set for text summarization. Instead of one document, we give 10 documents. We wanted to assess the retrieval capability of a language model. But in the future, someone decides that I can use this data set to assess like long context capability of a language model, and then becomes a norm that let's use this data set to assess something else. So how are we are we blocking novel applications if we provide like very strict guidelines for data sets?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're not necessarily blocking applications. I think through this structured reflection process in the short term, things will take potentially longer because you have to reflect and write down what you are doing and maybe debate with others. But I think it will save time in the long run, and that it leads the research community to not over-optimize on one particular way of doing things. And when you do decide to adapt other data sets, other people's data sets, and use them in a different way, there's nothing stopping you from doing that. In fact, you can use this framework, look at the original, if suppose people actually use this framework in the worksheets and they fill it out. You can look at that and help you figure out how, when you adapt the data set, things are different for you. And then you can fill out the worksheet and the worksheets for your particular application purpose and notes the differences. And maybe that will help you design actually better evaluation metrics and help you better design like what are some additional kinds of annotations you might need and so forth. So yeah, I agree it maybe slows things down in the short term, but hopefully it slows things down in a good way. And it won't block people from doing research that they care to do in the future. Oh, yes.
Yeah, in part two, you proposed many like principles in designing like these benchmarks, and I find it very interesting that you're able to apply these principles to analyze existing benchmarks and their shortcomings. I'm just wondering, is there a way to like quantify how well, for example, a particular data set conforms to the principles that you outlined, so that maybe as a research community would have a better idea about like which data sets we should focus more because we design with these principles in mind.
That's a really interesting question. So how to quantify these notions of validity and so forth. So there are some answers in the field that are probably not fully satisfying. Like you have to pick something that you fully trust, like maybe human judgments in a certain context or some outcome like additional revenue or whatever. And then you can correlate your decisions with that. So I think that's one way you can turn these qualitative judgments into something quantitative. But and then on the reliability side, that's much easier to quantify because reliability is about whether you can repeat measurements and get the same thing. And so then people have done that. on the reliability side. So at some point, though, it's I guess my epistemology is ultimately at the core. It's about values that you have and how those values are reflected in the deployment context and deployment scenario. So at that point, it might be very tough to quantify that. But once you've established that, then the next layer, then I believe you should be able to quantify and build some metric for that.
Thank you.
Given the time, I guess we can take one last short question.
Sorry, I have to. So I work because I also share some concern, especially regarding the evaluation metrics. And my question is about these days people are like to do a human evaluation, right? So they want to prove that our models fast, but no matter like what the metrics used as human like that, right? But I think human are inconsistency. Because even myself, I notate like even 100 samples, I cannot like ensure that 100% the same every time, right? And these days, I also saw some published papers on top conference really start to use ChatGPT or larger model to unload data or even evaluate their method. They talk about like our model get best results given the judgment from ChatGPT. But so we know that it's a production, so we know nothing about the back end, and it can be like developed, continued, updated someday, we don't know. And also for deep learning-based measure like burst score, they can be like, for example, a adversarial attack, like can check about the true type metrics, right? So basically, I think you can guess what I'm trying to say, like what the metrics I should use for future, and that's quite simple. Like just as a student, I'm quite curious about this.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's a very difficult question to answer fully. I would say that one thing to watch out for is to be careful about generalizing from the original context in which a metric was validated. I think that's one of the key things. Often, people validate one particular style of human evaluations and human judgments in one context, and as soon as you change even like relatively insignificant things, it no longer correlates with your gold standard. Like if your gold standard is human judgments and so forth. And when working with humans, there are like people, like subjects, there are guidelines and ways to do that to try to avoid some of these cognitive biases that people might have. So that's another literature that you can rely on to try to look at how to do human evaluations better. And also to think about humans' cognitive constraints. So for example, one relatively consistent finding is that comparisons is usually easier than rating according to an absolute scale. So things like that, you can read up on literature in psychology, and also in NLP, people have worked on this, of how to get, what are the protocols that lead to more reliable estimates. So I think it's through a combination of these practices that we can do a better job than before.
Okay, I guess given the time constraint, we have to stop now for the seminar, and let's thank Jack again for the.
Thank you very much.